The room wasn't designed for confrontation. It was a library, a real one. Wood-paneled walls, soft lighting, shelves filled with first editions, and thick volumes that smelled like old paper and colder mornings. Rachel Maddow sat at the far end of the table. No studio lights, no teleprompter, just a folder in front of her and a pen she didn't plan to use. She had been invited to moderate a discussion on public ethics in media and art. It was supposed to be a polite exchange, a symbolic gesture between generations. She wasn't expecting Al Pacino to show up. He entered quietly. No entourage, no announcement. He was smaller than people imagined, older than the posters suggested. His coat was frayed at the cuffs. His hair, wild and graying, looked like it had stopped asking for approval a long time ago. He nodded once to the room, once to Rachel, then sat down without saying a word. The organizers welcomed everyone. They gave brief remarks about legacy and responsibility. They said they were honored to have two cultural giants in one room. Then they handed the microphone to Rachel. She didn't reach for it. She leaned forward instead, her voice steady. "Mr. Pacino," she said, "do you believe legacy is something we shape or something we clean up after?" The room went still. Al didn't blink. He said, "Depends if you're still alive." A few quiet laughs rippled through the audience. Rachel didn't smile. She said, "You've played men who lie, who fight, who fall. You've said publicly that roles aren't endorsements. But what about silence? What does silence endorse?" Al looked at her for a long moment. He wasn't defensive, just careful. He said, "You ever spend your whole life pretending to be other people and then get surprised when no one asks who you are?" Rachel waited. Then she asked, "So who are you now?" The room held its breath. Al didn't answer right away. He turned in his chair, facing her directly, not the audience. "I'm a man who spent 40 years shouting lines someone else wrote," he said, and then woke up one day and couldn't remember the sound of his own voice. Rachel nodded slowly. "But you're still here," she said. "Still taking roles. Still making noise." He smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Noise is easy," he said. "You think noise means relevance. But most of the time, it just means you're afraid of quiet." Rachel glanced down at the folder in front of her, then closed it. She said, "There are stories people tell about you. Stories about sets, about choices, about scenes where things got blurred. You've never commented on them." Al didn't ask which stories. He didn't need to. He said, "You think I'm here to apologize?" "No," Rachel said. "I think you're here because you know the silence is getting louder." Al looked away for the first time. Out the window, into the evening light that spilled across the edge of the floor. He said, "I've lived through 7 decades of cameras, and I've learned something. Regret doesn't come with music. It comes in small rooms, when no one's asking for your autograph anymore." Someone in the back of the room coughed. No one laughed. No one moved. Rachel asked, "Is that what this is for you? Regret?" Al shook his head. "It's not regret," he said. "It's reckoning." Rachel leaned in, just slightly. "And what do you reckon with, exactly?" Al took a breath. Then he said something no one in the room expected. "I remember a woman I dated once. This was early, before Serpico, before I mattered. She used to write poetry and leave it in my coat pockets. I never read it. Not once. I told myself I was too busy, too focused. She left me a note the day she left. It said, 'If you can't hold still long enough to read me, you'll never understand what you've become.'" I never saw her again. The room was still. Rachel's voice softened. She said, "What did you become?" He looked right at her. "A man people listened to, but never a man who listened." Rachel folded her hands. "I think you're listening now," she said. Al nodded. "Maybe, but only because I ran out of things to say." Rachel paused. Then she said, "The question isn't whether you've changed. The question is what you do with the change." That was the moment. That was when the room felt it. The quiet shift, like gravity had bent differently for just a second. Al sat with that question. Not dodging, not deflecting, just holding it. Then he said, "I don't need to make another film. I don't need another award. I don't even need forgiveness. But I'd like to know what it feels like to be in a room where no one's pretending anymore." Rachel looked around, and for the first time, she smiled. She said, "Then maybe we start here." The silence held just long enough to feel intentional. Rachel glanced at the crowd, then back at Al. No one's pretending anymore, she repeated. That's not nothing. Al nodded faintly. Not nothing. But it's not forgiveness either. Rachel didn't argue. She said, forgiveness doesn't show up when you ask for it. It shows up when someone sees you clearly and doesn't flinch. The room didn't breathe. Al's voice dropped slightly. That's what scares me, he said. Being seen clearly. Without the myth. Without the costume. Rachel looked at him for a long moment. She said, the myth made you immortal. But the man beneath it, that's the part people are finally ready to meet. Al rubbed his hands together like someone warming them over a fire only he could feel. I spent years perfecting what people expected from me. The gravel in the voice. The slow turn of the head. The pause before the storm. It got me through a lot. Got me out of things too. Rachel's tone was steady. Gentle. Like what? Al stared at the table. Then, very quietly, he said, responsibility. There it was. The thing no one else had asked. The thing everyone thought he'd deflect. He didn't. He said, I knew how powerful presence could be. I knew how people tilted toward me in a room. I knew the weight of my voice when I said something as if it mattered. And I used that weight when I shouldn't have. In ways I won't explain. Not because I'm protecting myself, but because I don't want to use the stage again. Not for that. Rachel absorbed it. She said, then why sit here now? I looked up. Because I don't want to leave this world with the last word being a movie trailer. That landed like a stone dropped into deep water. Rachel opened the folder she'd closed earlier. She pulled out a single photo. It was old. Black and white. A candid shot from a movie set in the late 1970s. Al was standing with a young crew member. One hand on the kid's shoulder. The other pointing at something in the distance. His expression wasn't intense or legendary. It was curious. Kind. Even. Rachel slid the photo across the table. Do you remember this moment? Al stared at it. He didn't pick it up, but his jaw tightened. He said, that was Tommy. He was a grip. 20 years old. First job. He asked me what it felt like to be in control of a scene. I told him it wasn't about control. It was about conviction. I think he expected something bigger. Rachel said, he still talks about that conversation. Al looked surprised. Rachel continued. He's a producer now. Small studio. He told me you were the first person who ever spoke to him like his question mattered. Al leaned back in his chair. That's the thing, he said. You never know which small moment ends up being your legacy. You just hope it's not the one where you looked away. Rachel let that breathe, then said, do you believe legacy can be rewritten? Al thought for a long time. Then he said, no, but I think it can be re-understood. If you're willing to let go of the version of yourself you liked better. Rachel closed the folder completely. I think that's what this conversation is, she said. Not a rewrite. A re-understanding. Al nodded slowly. Then let it be honest. Rachel looked out at the room. Is there something you've never said? Because it would have broken the character everyone expected from you. Al didn't hesitate. Yes. Rachel waited. Al said that I was afraid. Not of failure. Not of being forgotten, but of being ordinary, of not being special after the cameras turned off. He paused. Because when you've spent your life convincing the world you're more than a man, you forget how to be just one. Rachel let the silence fall again. Not awkward, just respectful. Then she said, and now. Al looked at her, not through her, not past her, but directly at her, like a man who'd finally stopped looking for escape routes. Now. He said, I'm trying to remember how to talk without the echo. The room stayed silent. And in that silence, something shifted again. Not in Al. In everyone else. Because no one expected him to be afraid. And no one expected him to say it out loud. The audience didn't stir. Phones stayed down. No one whispered. Even the man near the back who had been taking notes closed his notebook. Not because he was finished, because something told him the moment needed witnesses, not transcribers. Rachel leaned slightly forward. Her voice was quieter now, but clearer. Fear of being ordinary, she repeated. That's not a small thing to admit. Especially when you've spent your life convincing people you weren't. Al Pacino nodded once, slowly. Being special is addictive, he said. It's like applause that follows you home. You start to believe it's love. And by the time you realize it's not, you're too far in to ask for the real thing. Rachel didn't smile. But something in her face softened. She said, "Do you think you've had the real thing?" Al didn't answer right away. Then he said, "Once or twice. But I didn't know how to hold it. I mistook recognition for intimacy. I thought being known was the same as being seen." A quiet breath passed through the room. Rachel said, "And now?" Al looked down at his hands. They shook slightly. He didn't hide it. "Now," he said, "I'm trying to learn how to be seen without asking for it." Rachel let that linger. She didn't interrupt it. She let it settle. Then she asked, "When was the last time you were proud of yourself without an audience?" Al blinked. That question hit differently. He thought for a long time, then said, 2 months ago. I helped a woman I didn't know get her dog out of a storm drain. No cameras. No one knew who I was. She just needed help. And I didn't explain. I just did it." Rachel asked, "Why that moment?" He said, "Because I didn't perform it." There it was. The confession beneath the confession. Rachel looked across the table, her tone now something more like reverence than inquiry. She said, "Is it hard for you to be unremarkable?" I'll let out the faintest breath of a laugh. "Yes," he said, "and it's also the only way forward now." Rachel leaned back, not in retreat, in respect. "I think a lot of people don't know how to say that," she said. Al replied, "That's because we spend so much time trying to matter that we forget how to just exist. And by the time we remember, we're afraid we'll disappear." Rachel looked around the room again, eyes wide. Still no movement. No coughing. No adjusting of coats. Just stillness, like everyone was standing inside a moment they didn't want to break. Al looked around too, not for approval, just to see if the room was real. He said, "I used to think moments like this only happened in scripts. Now I know the truth. They only happen when you stop performing the script you wrote for your life." Rachel asked, "What would you say now to the man you were 20 years ago?" Al didn't flinch. "I'd say, stop proving. Start listening. And when someone tells you they're hurting, don't give them a monologue. Give them your time." Rachel nodded. "And would he listen?" Al shook his head. "No. But maybe he'd remember it years later, sitting in a room like this." Rachel smiled. "For real this time. You're not trying to be forgiven," she said. Al said, "No. I'm just trying to be understood, without the echo." And that's when something shifted again. Someone in the audience, an older woman near the back, stood up. She didn't raise her hand. She didn't ask permission. She just stood, and after a moment, quietly said, "Thank you for not wasting this." No one clapped. But the room felt full, like something that had been missing for years had finally arrived. And no one was pretending anymore. The woman who stood didn't sit back down right away. She didn't explain her words. She didn't elaborate. She just looked at Al Pacino for a few seconds longer, then quietly returned to her seat. And something about her silence felt like the most respectful applause he had ever received. Rachel waited for the room to settle, then turned back to Al. She said, "That wasn't a confrontation. That was a mirror." Al nodded slowly. "Mirrors don't flatter," he said. "They just wait." Rachel said, "So what are you seeing now?" Al thought for a moment, then answered plainly, "I see a man who finally knows that being heard is not the same as being believed, and who wants, in whatever time is left, to say something he won't have to defend." Rachel said nothing at first. She gave him the space he had earned. Then she said, "You still have time." Al tilted his head, thoughtful. "I always thought time was what you spent chasing relevance," he said. "But I'm starting to believe time is what you give to things that can't give you anything back." Rachel rested her hands on the table. "Is that why you said yes to this? Not the spotlight, just the room?" Al looked her in the eye. "I said yes because I've played powerful men my whole life, and none of them ever taught me how to say, 'I was wrong.'" Rachel didn't flinch. She leaned in. "Then say it." The room inhaled. And Al said, "I was wrong to think that being admired meant being known. I was wrong to think that I could keep my private self untouched by the public one. I was wrong to believe that silence was safer than responsibility." He let the words land. No one moved. Then he added, softer now, "And I was wrong not to come to a room like this sooner." Rachel's voice followed like a hand on the shoulder. "But you came now, and now matters." Al looked around the room again, not for response, just to see who was still with him. They all were. Then Rachel turned the conversation gently. "Do you think actors owe the world more than performance?" Al smiled faintly. I think we all do. No matter our profession. I think people owe the world something real. Not polished. Not packaged. Just honest. Rachel said. Even when it hurts? Al said, especially then. For a moment, it felt like they had moved beyond interview. Beyond event. Beyond even confession. This was something else. A kind of communal stillness where no one wanted to leave. Where presence had replaced persona. Where two people sat in front of a room and dismantled decades of expectation, not with accusation, but with truth. Rachel turned one last time to Al, voice clear and steady. If this were your last public moment, would you be proud of it? Al didn't hesitate. I would, he said. Because I didn't perform. I participated. The lights in the library dimmed slightly as the sun outside shifted behind clouds. There was no music. No applause sign. Just the sound of one person exhaling near the front row and someone else quietly wiping their eyes. Rachel closed her folder. The conversation was over. But something had started. After the conversation ended, no one stood up right away. It wasn't hesitation. It was reverence. People stayed in their chairs the way they might stay in a pew after a funeral or a wedding. Not because they didn't know it was over, but because they knew something sacred had just happened, and you don't rush out of that. Al Pacino remained seated too. He didn't check his watch. He didn't adjust his coat. He looked around the room like a man trying to memorize what stillness feels like. Rachel gathered her folder, but didn't move either. She understood the weight of moments that don't announce themselves. And she knew better than to break them too soon. Finally, someone near the exit opened the door. But instead of noise flooding in, it was only late afternoon light. Warm, gentle, like the sun itself had waited for the right time to enter. Rachel stood first, then Al, and the two of them walked slowly to the edge of the room, together but apart. Not as host and guest, not as interviewer and subject, just two people who had met each other without pretense. Outside, a few reporters waited. Nothing invasive, just curious. They called out questions, but Al didn't answer. He didn't avoid them either. He just walked by quietly. That walk said more than a press release ever could. One photographer snapped a shot. It was later printed in a magazine with no headline, just a caption beneath the photo that read, "The echo after the noise." That night, social media did what it always does. Clips surfaced. Quotes were shared. But this time, something different happened. The moment didn't fracture into arguments or fan wars or trending hashtags. People didn't fight over it. They passed it to each other gently, like a letter they didn't want to crease. A veteran posted the clip with the words, "This made me call my brother." A teacher said, "I played this for my students today. We didn't talk afterward. We just sat with it." A woman wrote, "He said, stop proving. Start listening. I haven't stopped thinking about it since." And Rachel? Rachel didn't go on television that night. She didn't write a piece for the next day's show. She just sat in her office, alone, playing the conversation back on her laptop with headphones in. When it was over, she closed the lid and said aloud, to no one, that was the truth. Al went home, not to an event, not to a celebration, to a quiet apartment where the air smelled like books and wood polish, where the phone didn't ring unless someone meant it. He poured himself a glass of water and sat at the kitchen table. No notes, no press, just him. And after a long pause, he opened a small notebook he kept tucked between stacks of unread scripts. He wrote one sentence. "Today I told the truth and didn't ask anyone to clap." Then he closed the book, set down his pen, and exhaled like someone who had finally stopped holding something heavy. A week later, the footage of the conversation aired on public television. No edits, no commercials, no narrator explaining what it meant. Just two people in a library, sitting across from each other, trading silence and sentences like currency from a world that had nearly forgotten its value. The broadcast was unlisted. It aired late. It wasn't promoted. But people found it. And more importantly, they stayed. By morning, messages poured into the station. Not outrage. Not debate. Something rarer. Letters that began with, "I didn't expect to feel this much," and ended with, "Thank you for giving someone the space to change without shaming him for who he used to be." A therapist wrote that she'd played it for a group of men in recovery. One of them, silent for 3 months, spoke afterward for the first time. He said, "I think I've been performing too." In a small town in Wisconsin, a retired professor wrote a letter to his estranged daughter and mailed it after years of silence. A boy who had just turned 18 sent an email to the station. He wrote, "I've always thought being loud made me strong. But maybe I've been drowning out the part of me that just wants to be real." None of this was dramatic. None of it made headlines. But Al Pacino heard about it. His assistant brought him a stack of printed emails, some handwritten notes, and a few clippings. He read them all. He didn't comment. He just set them beside his notebook and left them there, untouched, like offerings. Rachel received letters too. Many from people who had never watched her show. People who didn't care about politics or cable news. People who only knew that something had happened between her and a man they thought they'd already figured out, and that they had felt it. She answered one of the letters herself. It was from a college student who asked, "How did you know when to stop pressing him?" Rachel wrote back, "When I stopped trying to win the moment and started listening for what mattered more than a response." She didn't sign her name. She didn't have to. The words were enough. And now, Al kept walking, not into the spotlight, but through it. He went to readings, quiet ones, small community events where no one expected anything but a seat and a story. He never read lines from old roles. He read letters people had sent him, moments people had lived, words they had written when no one else was watching. And sometimes he would close with the same line, soft but steady. "Thank you for reminding me that being remembered is not the same as being understood." The people who heard it never forgot it. And that library, where the moment began, it now held a plaque on the inside of the reading room door. It didn't mention names. It didn't describe the event. It just said, "Here, someone stopped performing and started telling the truth." And beneath it, in small letters, the kind you have to lean in to read, "Let your silence carry weight."